our session. So without much further ado, I'll invite our first speaker, Selena Yong, to be on the podium. Selena is the Senior Regional Technical Advisor for Asia Pacific under the Climate and Forest Program in UNDP, and she is based in Bangkok. She brings over 20 years of experience in climate change mitigation and forestry sector, forest and timber industries, forest certification, and timber legality schemes. She also worked in community forests, mediation, grievance redress, indigenous people, and participatory facilitation. Over to you, Selena.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today, all the distinguished delegates, and to share with you especially some of the experiences that we are going through and accumulating in this whole very interesting topic of carbon markets for the forest sector. And I look forward to an active exchange of views and also experiences from all delegates here as well. Next, please. I'm sorry, I don't know where my presentation is, so sorry if I'm looking a bit lost. I'm just trying to figure out where the presentations are. It's just online? Okay, great, thanks. So there are a couple of 4 key sections that we will run through, and they are the forest in nationally determined contributions, Section 2, options to finance NDC implementation, the UNFCCC and Article 6, the third section on, I'm sorry, can we have some, thank you. I cannot read in the dark. Thank you so much. And the third and fourth sections are where I would like to spend most of my time on and to share with you what we're going through. So the third section is about high integrity demand. What does it mean? This is what we're seeing as emerging from the markets, and especially a demand for the forest and land use sector in the carbon markets. And the fourth will end with challenges in Asia Pacific. So next slide, please. We're at the outline. Thank you. And first of all, just to acknowledge that this is a very dense presentation. There are a lot of words which might be hard to go through in the afternoon session when it's more comfortably a snooze time. But they are more for your reference materials. And what we'll do is I'll just focus on the key talking points and walk you through those. So I'll try to skim through quite quickly for the first 2 sections and focus more on sections 3 and 4. And the reason I'm doing this is because I usually speak to a different crowd. I usually speak to the climate mitigation crowd. So they are more familiar with some of these climate change sort of challenges that we're facing and how that's couched around it. So I may be introducing terminologies and concepts that might be relatively new, maybe not so, for some of you. So just want to spend some time on those so that we have a common starting point. So thank you for your patience in advance. Next, please. Great. So before I lose you through the rest of my presentation, there are just 3 big key points and key messages I'd like to reiterate right from the start. So I'm framing this presentation around something that is called the Nationally Determined Contributions, or the NDC, which I hope some of us would have heard of. And it's basically a country's contribution to how it's going to limit the global warming to not more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. It is in this statement, or in this NDC, where we have seen a lot of reference to REDD+, to forest and land use sector. That includes REDD+ under the UNFCCC. And I'll go in a bit later on to define when I say REDD+ under the UN framework on climate, Convention on Climate Change, what that means specifically. So that's the first key message. We're looking at this from the angle of the NDC. And the second is that accessing the carbon markets for the forest sector, and especially in the context of trying to implement and finance your NDC, is complex. It requires the country to take on strategic and political considerations. Why? Because you need to think about how you can maximize your investments that can then further go into maximizing or investing into your mitigation opportunities, right? And the point on this is when we refer to carbon markets, very often the thought just jumps to, oh, it's the VCM, it's the voluntary carbon market. But here I just want to flesh out that there are many different types of markets. You have the compliance, the voluntary, you have international, you have domestic. So it's not just the voluntary market that we're talking about here. And the third part is we have heard and we see this as a continuing discourse that they want, or countries or buyers want high integrity forest carbon markets. Now, what does that mean? And I'll try to unpack that a bit more. But in line with this increasing demand for high integrity, we're not seeing the price paid that commensurates with it, with the true cost of maintaining natural forests and high integrity. Next, please. Thank you. Next, please. So perhaps just a bit on the obvious, why are forests important or critical to climate emergency? I may be talking to a crowd of the converted here, but I just want to point out on two key points that the destruction of forests contributes to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, the forests sequester about 1/3 of forest carbon emissions. And of course, you have forest-dependent communities, indigenous communities globally who are dependent on forests and its resources as well. So this basically makes forests a key opportunity in terms of what a country can do to address the goals that it has set for itself in the NDC and thereby achieve the Paris Agreement. So when I'm talking about REDD+, I'm essentially talking about the 5 activities that have been specified in the UNFCCC. So we're talking about reducing deforestation, reducing forest degradation, sustainable management of forests, and then you have conservation of forest carbon stocks as well as enhancement of forest carbon stocks. So when I refer to something called REDD+, it's usually these 5 activities. So it may be stating the obvious, but I just need to get it out there. Next slide, please. Thanks. So here is a snapshot of a very recent synthesis of 166 countries' nationally determined contributions that have been compiled together by the UNFCCC, and this was released the last week of October. So you will see there an increase in the LULUCF sector. Basically, these are countries including this sector in what they say as a country they will do to meet the emissions targets. So this has increased from 73% to 85%. And you will see the different types, the breakdowns of the different types of activities or actions that they have included in the NDCs. And here, it's not captured graphically, but in a lot of the NDCs, we're seeing countries refer to the non-carbon benefits, so also the social and environmental benefits that will come out of implementation of such activities. Next, please. And here, I'm not going to walk through the diagram in detail, but I just want to give this as a flavor of REDD+ under the UNFCCC. So when we're talking about this, I'm using it to differentiate a bit from what we normally hear about REDD+ projects, which may be localized. And in the work that we have done with the countries globally, around 64 countries globally, we frame this around national REDD+ approaches as defined and as outlined in the UNFCCC. So countries that have worked on the national REDD+ strategy, they have set up a forest reference emission level, which is their baseline, how they are monitoring it, and then also the fact that they will submit a result of how much emissions they have reduced to the UNFCCC for technical assessment. And it's based on that in which a country can then say, we have reduced by this much from the forest and land use sector. And then of course, under the UNFCCC, there is an overall national safeguards summary of information as well. And this is basically a country reporting how they have addressed and respected safeguards related to the environment, safeguards related to the social side, as well as safeguards related to the governance side. And all that is to say, countries that have worked on this at the national level in the last 10 to 12 to 14 years, they have a strong fundamental basis in which they can then include this in their NDCs and how the NDCs are then subsequently reported. So the whole point of this visually quite compact slide is just to say that countries with over 10 years of working on the Warsaw Framework for RED+, which is what we call RED+ under UNFCCC, have a good foundation to build and implement and report on the NDCs. And this is also where we see entry points for any country's engagement in the carbon markets. Next, please. So all that is just quite a big preamble to introduce what we do. The UNDP Climate and Forest Program, basically we work with the countries to implement the Paris Agreement on these 5 activities, and we support the implementation of policies. We work with countries to see how they can access RED+ performance finance in line with their NDCs, and also facilitate a lot of this cross-exchange, the South-South, North-South exchange that countries are interested in. Next slide, please. Thank you. And we'll go into the options to finance NDC implementation. And I'm going to be introducing a bit of jargons here, which I hope to simplify as much as possible, and just walking you through the NDC jargon, or the alphabet soup, as I like to call it. Next slide, please. And in the recent report that the UNFCCC released, it says that 76% of NDCs say they would like to use international market mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a huge statement, because they do recognize that the finance for this may be limited. So how can we access different types of options? Next slide, please. And just to say, the Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty. It's what a country commits to do to reduce the global warming limits to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then the NDCs, as I've mentioned, is basically a country's communication about it. And so each party of the Paris Agreement needs to establish an NDC, and they need to update it every 5 years. So what the Paris Agreement has done, next slide please, is basically allowed a country, or allowed groups of countries, to consider how to increase their ambitions and also define new rules for the carbon markets. Next slide, please. And this is just to say, within this Paris Agreement, there is something called the Article 6. Some of you may or may not have heard of it. I'll just skim through this really quickly, because it does take a bit of time for some work that is still ongoing at this stage. But basically, it allows countries to cooperate with one another to implement their NDCs, and in such a way to allow for higher ambition, to promote sustainable development, and also to promote environmental integrity. Next slide, please. So this is a quick visual on Article 6. And what I want to highlight are just 2 points in here, Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. Article 6.2 is basically a bilateral or multilateral agreement between country and country. And this is something that's negotiated between these countries, and it contributes towards the implementation of the NDC. And the carbon credits or units that are sold through this, it's called the Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcomes, or the ITMOs for short. And Article 6.4 consists of a centralized governance system that is called Sustainable Development Mechanism. And this is where the private sector plays a part as well. And so in all this, there is room for the forest and land use sector. And this is part of the options and the opportunities that are coming up for countries as well. What I've not included in here, and which I'll just mention in passing, is if a country enters into a bilateral agreement, whether under Article 6.2 or 6.4, it will require something called a corresponding adjustments. Basically, if country X sells it to country Y, country X has to deduct it from the targets that they have set for themselves, and therefore they have to do more to meet the targets they have set, whereas country Y can then count it towards the targets that they have set. So these are huge considerations for countries in terms of how they want to engage with this, because it does affect how a selling country or a host countries might be able to meet its NDC implementation. Next, please. So here I won't really talk about this. We are in the midst of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh right now. But just to say, last year in COP26, there was huge progress on Article 6, and there was more clarity in terms of how that moves forward. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for developing countries in particular? Well, several details were defined in COP26 last year, and there are processes and procedures that a country needs to follow if they want to access carbon markets under the Article 6 agreement. So it's an opportunity for countries, but at the same time, it requires countries to take in a broad mix of policy decision, the trade-offs that are needed, and some of the technical requirements that are needed as well, and to decide the best way forward. And I'll link this to the challenges that countries are facing in these considerations. Next slide, please. So progress on Article 6 since COP26. So Article 6.2, further guidance remains to be developed to address some remaining gaps. There have been a lot of work that has taken place between Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh this year, and there have been some progress on Article 6.2. In Article 6.4, the supervisory body has been established, and they have been meeting and focusing on review of methodologies. And I understand they may have released a list of approved methodologies just in the last 24 to 48 hours, so that's ongoing as well. And then Article 6.8, which is about non-market approaches, so a Glasgow committee has been established. Next, please. And just to say, to wrap this up for Article 6, when we're talking about compliance market, we're essentially referring to Article 6.2 framework and Article 6.4 mechanisms, because this then it's something a country has to do, and it's something that will require corresponding adjustments as well. And when we're talking about voluntary carbon markets, it's basically what is outside of Article 6 right now. So there's a place for both. It's not either or. And it's this mix of what works best for a country that is in consideration right now. Next slide, please. Great. And so we've taken a quick deep dive into Article 6, but just to zoom out a bit to give you that complexity of the markets that we're talking about. So this is just a visual of what are the different types of markets that are out there. You have the compliance, the voluntary, the domestic, and the international. And then you have the different types of standards, what takes place domestically, what takes place that allows them to engage in international transactions as well. So I hope this visual helps you to see when a country wants to enter into something called a carbon markets, this is the plethora of many different types of requirements, standards, and expectations that they are dealing with. Next slide, please. So we're at part 3. Could I check with the facilitator how I'm doing with time? Good, thank you. So this is where I would like to spend a bit more time and just walk through with you in terms of the demands and the requests that we're hearing from developing countries, host countries, as well as the private sector, something that is called high integrity. Now, what does that mean, actually? Next slide, please. So we have seen in the last 2 years, and especially in the last year or so, a rapid increase in the voluntary markets, and especially in the forest and land use sector. And just to say, in this particular market, The UNFCCC has no jurisdictions over these transactions because they are aligned to various international standards. So the VCM, ongoing VCM projects, ongoing RED Plus projects and the programs, they can continue without any reference to the Article 6 modalities, right? But Article 6 does provide the flexibility if the host country chose to do so, to look at how it wants to use the opportunities and the benefits from the voluntary carbon markets that will contribute towards its NDC implementation as well. So that's just a quick statement about that. Next slide, please. And again, this is just a graphic to show that between 2020 and 2021, we've seen a huge jump in VCM transactions. And these ones, the ones in blue, yes, that's right. That's the one specifically for forest and land use sector. And I would say this more or less coincides with the expectations around some concrete decisions coming out of COP26 on Article 6, right? So there's a growing private sector interest. They want to engage. We're seeing a lot of them make requests, looking for markets, looking for suppliers, but also coming up with demands. And so there is a potential risk here for greenwashing. You know, will what they do and what they buy actually contribute towards reducing emissions? And so carbon markets does play a key role in the transition process. But here we're going to look at some demand and supply issue as well as environmental integrity issues as well. So next slide, please. And here's just another slide just to show the size that has increased. And this is from the carboncredits.com source. But that's just to give you a visual. And so I do not find it surprising that there is great interest here in the ITTC Council for this year, because it very much reflects the request that is out there. And this slide is not just for the forest and land use sector. It covers all sectors, just to point that out. Next slide, please. And this is a recent report from the Forest Trends Ecosystem Marketplace for the third quarter of the year. And I just want you to pay attention to the first row for the forest and land use. And in between 20 and 20, by volume, just for this particular sector alone, it has increased 4 times. And then in terms of the price that has been paid, there is a higher price now for removals. That's around $7.90 US for both 2020 and 2021. And this is almost $3 higher than the combined reductions and removal credits. So we're seeing a different type of demand for the credits. It's no longer just reduction credits, but it's for removal credits, which are far more valuable, but also a bit more technically complex and difficult to achieve. So in this, we will see that the RED Plus remains the most dominant project type traded in this category called the forest and land use. So there is great demand there. Next slide, please. And here, I just want to share a bit in terms of what companies are saying. And this is derived from a global dialogue, a series of global dialogues we had with developing countries globally, as well as the private sector, as well as the project developers last year, and what they're saying about integrity. If you can just click through 5 clicks, thanks. So the buyers are saying, well, you know, avoided deforestation types of projects does generate large volumes, but I'm not sure whether they are real. So this brings in the issue of the baseline. Is this real? How accurate are the baselines? I want to buy removal credits, especially from reforestation types of activities, but they are expensive. They are more expensive. And there are smaller volumes involved. And the graph there is just to show you the jump, the exponential increase over the last year as well. And then there is an ongoing initiative or endeavor that looks at trying to group REDD+ initiatives on the ground beyond just a localized size, beyond just a project size, something that is called jurisdictional REDD+ programs. So there are standards out there. Countries are putting this into place, but they are not market ready. There are no market ready credits yet, and they may still have high reversal risks. And then, of course, for a corporate that wants to invest in this, what are potential reputational risks that I may face? How are indigenous peoples treated? Are the land rights clear? How are the benefit sharing mechanisms shared out? Is it clear? Is it something that's acceptable by all parties? Are their rights being respected? And basically, how do we deal with this reputationally as a corporate? So these are some of the questions that we have heard from companies who are interested to purchase, but they have these questions as well. And what this leads to is the next slide, which talks about the demand for more integrity of carbon credits. And this was incorporated into the Article 6 rule book. Basically, how can we look into this? How do we avoid double counting? How do we, and which is put into place, what the overall mitigation in global emissions is supposed to take care of. And also then looking into when the corporate claims they have a net zero emission or they're going to be carbon neutral, what are the parameters, what are the scope that's set for that, so that the corporates can be seen to be also doing something active to reduce their carbon emissions and not just, as the phrase goes, not just offset their way into neutrality. So all this is just to say that there is a lot of interest, there is a lot of call for high integrity carbon credits in the forest sector as well. And the next slide, there are 5 key segments of which we look at to see what integrity is made out of. Next slide, please. Thanks. And again, these comes from the dialogues we've had with, I think, over 60 countries last year globally. And first they're saying, well, for us, integrity means there is no double counting, which means the buying country and the selling country, or the buyers and the sellers, it can only be counted once, right? So it only appears in their books once. And the second part is that the emissions reductions are real. And here we look at the challenge of an inflated baselines, which has been historical for some of these older projects, forestry types of projects. How do we deal with that? And this has lent itself to concerns about are we selling hot air or are we buying hot air? So there's concerns around that. And also, will a company actually take real action to decarbonize internally rather than just buy carbon credits to offset? So those are the first 2. And then the third is really also about corporates asking of the selling countries, well, do you have robust institutional arrangements? Do you have clear financial infrastructure for all these transactions to take place? Do you have a clear benefit sharing mechanism? Do we know if we pay for this, where it's going to go and who is going to manage this, and whether we're going to have to deal with multiple ministries or we can go through a centralized coordination body and with very clear next steps. And they are also asking for countries to ensure that there are adequate social and environmental safeguards to mitigate the potential adverse impacts. So that's a high ask as well. And alongside that would be a big ask on respecting human rights, including indigenous people's rights, and also clarity over corporate net zero and carbon neutral claims. And for this, some of you may have been involved or you may have heard of initiatives such as the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, or the VCMI, or the ICVCM, the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Markets, which basically looks at defining, setting parameters for corporations in terms of how they can put together a claim that is called net zero. Next slide, please. And I head into my last section, which talks about challenges that we have faced specifically in the Asia-Pacific region. We are a global team. We do work in 64 countries, but I'm just zooming in for the Asia-Pacific region. Next slide, please. And this is just a graphic of the region, countries in the region that we cover. So the 3 to 4 key lessons I will share with you after this is an accumulation of the experiences so far. Next slide, please. So with these increasing interests in the carbon markets, a lot of the developing countries, especially the governments, now have huge actors, huge masses of actors, interested actors, private sector, governments, donors who are coming to them saying, we're interested to work with you on the carbon markets, whether it's under Article 6 or whether it's the private sector with a voluntary carbon market. But if you remember the visuals, several slides back, you will see how complex the market is. Different types, different requirements, different standards, which all requires clear institutional arrangements, clear financial transactions, how you're going to share all these benefits. So these governments in developing countries, very often they are lost, right? So there is a limited knowledge in what they know. And then there's limited skill in terms of, okay, we understand what these standards are asking for. How do we put that into practice? And for countries where they have had or they have ongoing REDD+ projects, how can we reconcile this with the national forest emissions, reference emissions levels that we have set? How can we ensure that there is synchronicity or we can try to align this in a way so that we can prove there is integrity in what is going on? So as a consequence, we're hearing a number of countries in the region at least say, for now, we're just going to focus on our domestic carbon markets to try and set that up until we're clear how to engage internationally. Because if they engage in Article 6, it's going to require corresponding adjustments, and that might affect their NDCs as well. So really, the key question that the countries in the region are facing is basically, how can we make use of these opportunities strategically? What are the trade-offs that we need to consider? What assets do we have? Who is going to be in charge? What is a minimum market price that we can consider? Which sectors should we focus on first? When and where does the forest and land use sector come in? Next slide, please. And a lot of these countries do have different types of support from other countries, from donors, from bilaterals, but these are often quite pre-packaged in a way. So they're not really catered to the local needs and the circumstances. And so the countries are saying, it's great, it's fine, but we have many initiatives here. So we need to find a way to ensure that the funds or the resources that we're receiving really goes towards what's needed for our country. It reflects the country context. Next slide, please. And just to end on this, that with the increasing demand, we have corporates that are doing a lot of due diligence because there are reputational risks that they are concerned about. And we do see there's a slight increase in price, but it's not enough to cover, or it does not reflect the true cost of maintaining forests and the high integrity requirements. Will the market adjust? Will there be a price differentiation as the markets become more evolved and more mature? Perhaps so. We're not quite sure yet. And finally, on to my last slide, and it's just a reiteration of the 3 key messages I shared in the beginning. So if you walk away with nothing, I hope you remember these 3 key messages. The first is the work that we do is couched in the nationally determined contributions. The work we have done with countries in the last 10 to 14 years with the REDD+ fits in there. And so there are a lot of opportunities for what is taking place in the country to be embedded there as well. And a country, especially developing countries, when they want to engage in the carbon markets for the forest sector, it's basically a lot of strategic and political considerations that they have to consider. And sometimes the scarcity of data and information is a big barrier. And the last point is just to say there's a lot of demand for high integrity forest carbon markets, but we've not seen the price commensurate with the demand. And with that, thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to exchanges and any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Selina. Our next speaker is Ivan Tomaselli. Many of us would, of course, know Ivan for many years. Ivan is a founder and is currently the president of STCP, which is a consulting, engineering, and management company in Brazil. From 1977 to 2010, he was a professor at the Federal University of Paraná and has since worked as a consultant in international organizations such as the FAO, ITC, ITTO, World Bank, IDB, and others. Currently, Ivan is the vice president of the Brazilian Association of Mechanically Processed Timber, IBMC. Ivan, please.
Thanks, Barney. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, especially after a long time. And thanks to ITTO and to our friends from TAG for the invitation. I'm not an expert on carbon. Let's start, make it quite clear. I'll be talking about carbon projects in Latin America and try to answer this question. Is managing tropical forests for timber and carbon a fate or a fake? This is a result of our company. We've been supporting many clients around the world and many sectors outside of the forest sector to assess this opportunity. So I will consider our experience along the last years and try to share with you some information and some knowledge we have gained on carbon projects associated with sustainable forest management. Next slide, please. This is the content of my presentation. I will talk very shortly about legal issues. We had just a beautiful presentation on that, so I don't have to go into details. I'll try to give you more information on carbon projects associated with sustainable forest management in Latin America. Next slide, please. For sure, carbon market is a necessary path in today's world, and also is an opportunity. There are a variety of schemes and types, including RED+, biogas, energy conservation, waste handling and disposal, and others. And there is a growing interest in Latin American carbon projects. Next slide, please. I think we have jump one. Oh, next. That's okay. It's okay. Well, there is a general commitment to reduce or achieving net zero emissions by announcing high-level commitments or embedding targets in laws and regulations. As you can see in this slide, you basically have two types of mechanisms. The CPI, carbon pricing instrument, which is a mandatory mechanism, and the voluntary offsetting. It's a non-mandatory basis mechanism driven by companies and private individuals. Next slide, please. There is a worldwide framework involving the reduction of emissions, cooperation, negotiation among parties, and other issues. This has started back in the 1987 with the Kyoto Protocol, and later we had in 2015 negotiations involving the Paris Agreement and other instruments. Most of them you are aware of it. I'm not going to enter into details. Next, at the country level, there are laws, regulations involving this matter. As you can see in this slide, in countries such as Brazil, Colombia, and Peru, you have regulations. Some countries, like Colombia, for instance, implemented a national carbon tax on fossil fuels, allocating the revenue in the Sustainable Colombian Fund. Comparing with other countries, Brazil has a much simple legal framework. Legal framework is less developed, and we are more in the voluntary market. Next slide, please. From the demand side, there is basically two options. You have the compliance, which is basically domestic pricing, carbon taxes, sectorial schemes, and others. And you have the voluntary or business responsibility and personal responsibilities. From the supply side, you have the under-emission trading system, ETS, generated and distributed by governments. It's a kind of a permit to emit. And you have the under-crediting programs, which are project-based and are certified by specific bodies. Next one, please. This is the global evolution of carbon credits issuance that started basically in the early 2000s. All registries involving all projects types achieved in 2021 almost 400 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Around 75% of this amount were verified projects. It's worth to note that out of the total credit issuance, approximately 50% are REDD+ and forestry-based projects. You can see in the right side the relative importance of REDD+ and forestry projects. Next one, please. In Latin America, the total amount of carbon issuance achieved 98 million tons of CO2 equivalent. It's one-fourth of the total global issuance. As you can see, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru have most of this total. Next one, please. As mentioned to you previously, 75% of the global projects were verified by Verra. In Latin America, Verra is even more prominent. Verra verified projects in 2021 in the region achieved 82 million tons of CO2 equivalent, or around 84% of the total. 78% of these projects were RED and forestry-based type projects. Next one. So this gives you an information about the total number of projects registered on AFLU, which is agriculture, forest, and land use projects in Brazil, Peru, and Colombia, including the number of projects, the area covered, and the estimated reduction. Next one, please. Latin America is expanding its participations in both compliance and voluntary market. In most countries of the region, like Colombia, Mexico, Chile, and others, are mainly compliance projects, while in Brazil is mostly voluntary. Latin America is the second world largest provider of voluntary carbon credits, which is around 20% of the total global. Next one, please. I want to stress to you the importance of Latin America for forestry-based project and sustainable forest management. In Latin America are located 22% of the global forest, and around 137 million hectares are under long-term forest management plans. This area can be managed to produce timber, or is managed to produce timber, and can be managed as well to produce for carbon credits. Next one, please. I have made a calculation of the carbon credits potential, taking into consideration the area covered by long-term forest management plans in Latin America, which is 137 million hectares. In this area, we have a potential to generate almost $2 billion per year on carbon credits at current prices. I just said, has a potential. Well, next please. But this is the reality. Latin America has 25% of the total global credit issued, but a few areas are managed for timber production. Few areas managed for timber production have projects for carbon generation credits. One example which I want to mention to you is a project of a forest area managed for timber production located in the Amazon. This area has around 80,000 hectares and generates credits of 2 tons per hectare of CO2 equivalent per year. This area contributes, this carbon generation contributes with 10% of the total revenue of this property. It's interesting to note that other alternatives are under development. We are talking about projects of forest restoration. These projects are designed to recover degraded land and generate carbon credits as the main revenue. In these areas, timber production is considered to be a complementary revenue. So we are starting to generate more credits from carbon than from timber in managed areas. Next one, please. I just want to make some conclusions of my presentation and to mention to you that carbon development, as already mentioned, is a necessary path to reduce or to achieve net zero emission target, and is also an opportunity to those managing forestry for timber production. In Latin America, 80% are RED and forestry type of projects and traded mostly in the voluntary market, and this trend is expected to continue. Only a few areas in the region are managed for timber production, have registered carbon projects, but the potential to generate revenue is significant, and this option is an opportunity to promote sustainable forest management. It seems to be important to fully assess the constraints faced by forest owners and by timber industry, managing forestry to develop and register projects to issue and trade carbon credits. We need to know why so far only a few projects have been registered. Based on this type of assessment, it seems to be important also to implement a program to improve the knowledge and provide technical assistance aiming to integrate the generation of carbon in sustainable forest management and timber production. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivan. Our next speaker is Pierre Schuller. Pierre is in charge of the climate and ecosystem services for the consulting firm Teoria, specializing in the environment, sustainable forest management, timber industry, agroforestry. Teoria works in France, Gabon, Cameroon, and Argentina. He's also the co-president and co-secretary of the Carbon and Biodiversity Commission of ATIBT, whose role is to guide and inform the association's member and tropical forest operations on carbon market issues. Pierre, please.
Merci Barney. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Ravi et très honoré d'être présent dans le cadre de cette market discussion de l'ITTO sur le thème Carbon Trade and Tropical Forest. Donc, dans la continuité des présentations précédentes, j'aborderai à mon tour les exemples et les défis que représente la réalisation de projets carbone, cette fois-ci dans le contexte africain. Next, please. Je tournerai principalement ma présentation autour de l'Afrique centrale et notamment d'un bassin forestier en particulier, le bassin du Congo, qui représente une importance toute particulière en termes des services écosystémiques et climatiques notamment. En effet, ces forêts sont disposées sur 6 pays pour une superficie d'environ 240 millions d'hectares qui fait d'elle la seconde plus vaste forêt tropicale au monde. Et son importance est multiple pour les multitudes de services qu'elle peut rendre et en particulier pour celui que l'on nomme comme le premier poumon vert de la planète. Pour son rôle dans la lutte contre le changement climatique, sa capacité à absorber en net plus de CO2, soit environ 0,61 milliards de tonnes de CO2 par an, ce qui est plus que le bassin amazonien qui est aujourd'hui environ à l'équilibre et encore plus que l'Asie du Sud-Est, déficitaire d'environ 0,49 milliards de tonnes de CO2 chaque année. Cette aire géographique est aussi un véritable puits de carbone, notamment grâce à ces tourbières de la cuvette centrale située entre le nord du Congo et la République démocratique du Congo, d'une superficie de 145 000 km², qui contient une quantité de carbone 20 fois supérieure aux émissions annuelles des États-Unis en gaz à effet de serre. Ces forêts sont toutefois bien plus encore vis-à-vis des services écosystémiques qu'elle peut rendre via une véritable réserve majeure mondiale en termes de biodiversité endémique, les foyers de nombreuses communautés autochtones, les ressources en eau primordiales et plus encore. Il est donc évidemment nécessaire de les préserver, de les gérer durablement en ce qui concerne les pratiques forestières, et cela peut être permis par des incitations financières aujourd'hui élargies aux services rendus par la nature et notamment les marchés du carbone. Next, please. Comme évoqué par les intervenants précédents, les mécanismes REDD+, font partie de ces solutions incitatives à l'échelle étatique et juridictionnelle. Pour de nombreux pays africains, le mécanisme REDD+, était une opportunité de recevoir des financements conséquents de la part de fonds internationaux. De fait, les pays se sont rapidement lancés dans ces processus et aujourd'hui, on dénombre 25 pays africains ayant développé une stratégie REDD+ nationale. Next, please. Le Gabon, que j'ai pris comme exemple, est très intéressant dans ce cadre-ci, puisque celui-ci ne se reconnaissait pas à l'origine dans la politique REDD+, du fait de son statut HFLD, High Forest Low Deforestation. En effet, ce pays a maintenu son couvert forestier historiquement, et aujourd'hui, le pays absorbe plus de gaz à effet de serre qu'il n'en émet. Ainsi, le Gabon a choisi une voie parallèle en passant une Letter of Intent avec le CAFI en 2017 qui vise à récompenser le pays pour les émissions évitées, les efforts et de maintien de leur niveau des stocks de carbone. Cela en fait le premier pays à bénéficier de paiements pour résultat pour la déforestation et la dégradation évitée, ainsi que l'absorption de CO2 et la conservation de ces stocks de carbone. Cela lui a permis d'obtenir notamment en 2021 des fonds à hauteur de 17 millions de la part du CAFI et de probables belles opportunités à venir pour la suite, avec notamment la certification par la CNUC de crédit carbone sur la période 2010-2018. Next, please. Ainsi, on constate aujourd'hui dans ces pays une tendance aux initiatives nationales ou juridictionnelles plutôt qu'aux projets volontaires qui peinent encore à générer des crédits et donc à se financer. Nous allons voir maintenant pourquoi. Next, please. Les forêts africaines ont beau avoir un enjeu énorme sur la scène internationale, il n'existe aujourd'hui que très peu de projets carbone volontaires sur le continent africain. Et encore moins dans les pays les plus forestiers, ceux qui sont notamment membres de l'ITTO. Aujourd'hui, en prenant le standard volontaire Vera, qui représente 76% des crédits carbone volontaires vendus et commercialisés au monde, on ne dénombre que 100 projets AFOLU, Agriculture, Forestry and Other Land Use. Et sur ces 100, seuls 24 projets sont purement forestiers, répartis dans les 3 grandes catégories de projets, RED, donc Reducing Emission from Deforestation and from Degradation, IFM, Improve Forest Management, et ARR, Afforestation, Reforestation and Revegetation. Parmi eux, seuls 9 pays africains membres de l'ITTO ont enregistré des projets dont 12 RED, 8 ARR, 2 IFM seulement. 2 sont des mix RED-ARR. Les projets RED+, sont, entre guillemets, plus faciles à mettre en place car il existe de nombreuses méthodologies et la promesse de beaucoup de crédits carbone en fonction du scénario adapté, évidemment. En revanche, les projets IFM, qui sont, pour la précision, les seuls types de projets qui permettent de générer des crédits carbone pour de la gestion forestière, à proprement parler, sont moins nombreux et signent des difficultés que peut présenter la profession à développer des projets carbone, mais nous reviendrons sur ces détails par la suite. Next, please. Voyons justement quelques exemples rapides de ces projets qui concernent la gestion durable en Afrique centrale et qui sont révélateurs des problématiques actuelles que peuvent rencontrer ces porteurs de projets. Un premier exemple situé dans le Nord Congo, le projet Pikunda Nord, développé au sein de l'unité forestière d'aménagement de la société CIB-OLAM. Ce projet date de 2011, donc assez ancien vis-à-vis des projets carbone, et vise à réduire la dégradation et la déforestation planifiée d'une zone prévue initialement pour être exploitée. Ce projet donc, est enregistré comme RED+, et on peut faire ressortir 2 constats de cet exemple. Le premier est que ce projet représentait des opportunités importantes au démarrage, mais qui n'a pas été suivi par le porteur de projet, malheureusement, ce qui n'a pas pu permettre de générer des crédits carbone et donc de les vendre sur les marchés. Le second constat est que ce projet, enregistré comme RED+, utilise en réalité une méthodologie, la VM0011 sur le standard Vera, qui est associée à une activité d'Impro Forest Management, associée aussi à Log to Protect Forest. Donc, cela montre le flou qui existe au sein de la terminologie des projets et initiatives RED+, et la méconnaissance des acteurs des concepts associés au carbone, et en particulier de ce type de projet. Sur l'exemple suivant, dans les cadres de projets RED en Afrique, il est nécessaire d'aborder les cas, en tout cas, de la République démocratique du Congo, qui est peut-être le pays africain qui possède parmi les plus grandes initiatives RED+ au monde. Le projet RED+ Maïdombe en fait partie. L'objectif de ce projet était donc de mettre en conservation des forêts prévues pour être exploitées à l'origine, éviter l'extraction non durable de bois de chauffage et l'agriculture sur brûlis. Ce projet a été certifié VCS et CCB pour l'éco-bénéfice associés. Et ce projet fait partie des quelques success stories que l'on rencontre en Afrique, puisqu'il a vendu et vend encore des crédits sur le marché volontaire. Toutefois, une nuance importante, c'est que ce projet était censé être intégré dans un projet RED+ juridictionnel plus vaste à l'échelle de la région Maïdombe. Cependant, ce projet à vaste échelle n'est pas encore opérationnel pour diverses raisons, ce qui permet au projet, à l'échelle projet, de générer et vendre encore des crédits carbone sur le marché volontaire. Cela montre les relations complexes qu'il existe aujourd'hui entre les projets juridictionnels et les projets, disons, privés. Next, please. Pour prendre un cas de projets IFM, nous l'avons vu, il n'en existe que très peu en Afrique. Un de ces exemples est situé au Nord Congo également, sur l'UEFA Ngombe de l'entreprise IFO du groupe Interolco. Ce projet est encore au stade de développement au niveau du standard Vera, car initié en 2021, donc très récemment, mais aura pour objectif de mettre en œuvre de l'exploitation forestière à impact réduit pour réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre via la méthode REAL-C. Et ce projet est donc très ambitieux et est à suivre avec attention, car cela pourrait ouvrir la voie dans la région. Next, please. Pour parler rapidement des projets ARR, un exemple que j'ai choisi, les plateaux Bateke, situés au Congo, qui est un projet de plantation agroforestière avec comme alternative au bois énergie à usage urbain et transformation de charbon pour les populations. C'est un projet encore une fois très récent, puisque développé en 2020, et qui n'a donc pas généré encore de crédit carbone. Toutefois, ici, il est à préciser que c'est un projet développé sur un contexte de savane, donc pas directement sur des cas de forêt naturelle. Et c'est généralement ce que l'on peut faire ressortir aussi des projets ARR, c'est que ce n'est pas des projets comme les projets IFM ou RED+, qui touchent directement à ce type de milieu. J'ai donc dressé rapidement quelques exemples assez connus du bassin du Congo, mais j'aurais pu très bien citer de multiples autres projets, comme les projets RED à Madagascar, qui sont peut-être parmi les plus anciens existants en Afrique, et les quelques success stories que l'on connaît sur ce continent. Ou encore en Afrique de l'Ouest, au Ghana par exemple, avec des exemples de plantations forestières qui ont su générer des crédits carbone et les vendre sur les marchés volontaires. Donc, next please. En somme, des projets carbone existent, mais peu ont généré de crédits carbone, bien que les processus de certification aient été lancés il y a quelques temps. Si vous pouvez revenir en arrière, juste, mais c'est pas grave. La majorité des projets ont été développés aussi ces dernières années et on manque aujourd'hui d'antériorité pour envisager une généralisation. Ok, donc on est sur la bonne diapositive. Malgré les chiffres que nous avons vus précédemment et de l'expérience que j'ai pu retirer de mon expérience, de nombreuses entreprises forestières en Afrique, en particulier dans le bassin du Congo, s'intéressent de près aux questions de ces rémunérations carbone. En effet, aujourd'hui, la diversification des revenus dans le cadre de la gestion durable des forêts est un sujet à part entière chez ces opérateurs qui n'arrivent pas forcément à dégager suffisamment de marge en raison des charges et des coûts engendrés par la certification. Cela est donc très important d'avoir des financements complémentaires pour que cela crée des incitations envers ces entreprises qui sont déjà certifiées et possiblement inciter celles qui ne le sont pas encore à le devenir. En parallèle, on constate effectivement, comme il a été précisé dans les présentations précédentes, que les cours actuels montrent une montée en puissance du prix de vente des crédits carbone allant donc de environ 7 $ sur les projets africains sur la période 2019 à 12 à 13 $ en moyenne en 2021. Les prévisions à l'horizon 2030 penchent vers une augmentation de 20 à 30 $, à 50 $ pardon, la tonne, ce qui serait substantiel, d'une part pour revenir au niveau des marchés nationaux qui existent dans certains pays, vis-à-vis des prix différenciés au niveau des marchés internationaux. Et cela permettrait donc évidemment une incitation financière, une incitation pour les entreprises à aller vers la certification. Next, please. Toutefois, lorsque l'on discute avec ces forestiers, ils expriment leur méconnaissance de ces mécanismes de marché qui ne sont évidemment pas leur domaine d'expertise et se retrouvent perdus parfois face aux méandres de règles et critères qui régissent les crédits carbone quand il s'agit de vouloir réaliser un projet. Ces derniers sont en plus généralement assez longs, coûteux, complexes à réaliser. Next, please. Les entreprises forestières doivent être ainsi bien accompagnées par les organismes qui les représentent, et c'est notamment ce que la Commission carbone et biodiversité de la TIBT tente de réaliser par ses actions. L'ITTO pourrait également accompagner à une échelle plus générale ce genre d'action. Next, please. De l'autre côté, on constate que les volumes de transactions de crédit carbone sur les marchés volontaires issus de projets forestiers se sont envolés ces dernières années, multipliés par 4 entre 2020 et 2021. Next, please. No, sorry. That's fine. Sauf que la demande en crédit carbone basée sur la nature dépasse aujourd'hui largement leur offre. Il n'y a pas assez de crédits certifiés carbone pour contenter la demande en crédit carbone sur des entreprises. Pardon. Ceci peut expliquer aussi en partie le manque de connaissances nécessaires pour éclairer et hiérarchiser les décisions d'investissement. En effet, les attentes des entreprises qui sont les acheteurs d'un côté sont parfois très éloignées des besoins des porteurs de projets sur le terrain, les vendeurs de l'autre, qui ne favorisent pas le développement de nouveaux projets. Plus spécifiquement, sur les projets qui concernent la gestion durable des forêts, ceux-ci sont souvent mal compris par les investisseurs qui assimilent parfois injustement la gestion forestière comme de la déforestation, et ce qui peut devenir évidemment moins attractif pour le développement de projets. Il y a ainsi un fort enjeu lié à la communication et une nécessité de réaliser du storytelling pour améliorer l'image de l'exploitation forestière durable et attirer les investisseurs vers ces projets, ce que fait par exemple l'entité marketing de la TIBT, Fair and Precious. Next, please. Certains critères relatifs au carbone sont également contraignants d'un point de vue technique. Par exemple, l'additionnalité, qui est une étape incontournable d'un projet. Carbone qui vise à montrer l'évolution de la quantité stockée sans que ce projet n'ait eu lieu, et que le financement du projet permis par la vente des crédits carbone est indispensable à sa réalisation, et que les actions en place sont plus ambitieuses que les exigences réglementaires des pays dans lesquels se situent les projets. Cette additionnalité, dans le cas des entreprises forestières certifiées gestion durable, peut devenir un réel frein, notamment visant l'amélioration des pratiques dans un objectif de réduction des émissions. Next, please. Pour illustrer ce cas de figure et permettre de mieux comprendre ce problème, prenons donc le schéma qui est affiché. Ici, nous pouvons observer plusieurs niveaux de pratiques forestières. Tout en haut, les niveaux de pratiques conventionnelles. Au milieu, les pratiques de niveau de légalité qui correspondent à des plans d'aménagement, notamment avec les critères associés pour la certification de légalité. Et à la fin, les niveaux REAL, donc Reduce Impact Logging, qui correspondent à des niveaux de pratique que les entreprises forestières certifiées gestion durable doivent atteindre. Ainsi, les niveaux de pratique, entre chaque niveau de pratique, on constate qu'il y a des gaps qui sont représentés par les flèches rouges, bleues et vertes. Le premier gap correspond à un passage de pratiques conventionnelles à des pratiques de gestion durable des forêts. Et ce gap permettrait donc de réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre et donc de générer des crédits carbone qui seraient, vu la quantité, très incitatifs pour les entreprises à aller vers cette conversion. La flèche bleue correspond au gap entre les pratiques de légalité et les pratiques de gestion durable. Ici, ce gap est un un peu inférieur vis-à-vis de la flèche rouge. Toutefois, ceci pourrait présenter des incitations suffisantes pour les entreprises à aller vers la certification. La flèche verte, cependant, correspond à des niveaux de pratique de gestion durable des forêts. Ici, pour que les entreprises forestières aillent au-delà de ces pratiques qui sont déjà très hauts au niveau des normes, il faudrait qu'ils passent par des projets IFM et notamment de méthodologie REAL-C. Or, ici, le gap pour générer des crédits carbone est très faible et cela présente des incitations peu suffisantes pour envisager justement que ces entreprises passent à ces méthodologies-là. Next, please. La barrière de l'additionnalité se pose donc quant à la possibilité de générer des quantités de crédits dans les différents scénarios que nous venons de voir, et notamment du point de vue de la législation du pays. Pour prendre un exemple, au Gabon, ce pays, d'ici 2025, va obliger l'ensemble des entreprises forestières à se faire certifier gestion durable des forêts. Et ainsi, les flèches rouges et vertes bleues que nous avons vues précédemment ne pourront pas prétendre à des crédits certifiés et uniquement la marge correspondant à la flèche verte pourront être générables, sauf que comme nous l'avons vu, l'incitation n'est pas suffisante dans ce cas-ci. Next, please. Sur ce point, il pourrait être considéré une révision des cadres normatifs, des critères carbone, mais cela serait difficile à envisager car cela remettrait en cause les fondements même de ces critères du carbone. Une autre solution serait d'orienter les entreprises forestières vers d'autres types de projets comme l'arrêt de plus, mais au détriment de l'activité d'exploitation en lui-même et donc de l'activité de ces entreprises. Les seules autres solutions pour bénéficier concrètement de crédits carbone seraient de s'orienter vers une optique de baisse absolue des émissions obtenue par l'augmentation de la durée des rotations ou l'augmentation des diamètres moyens d'abattage. Toutefois, cela remettrait évidemment en cause le modèle économique des entreprises qui devraient repenser entièrement leur production. Next, please. Un autre défi auquel doivent faire face les opérateurs au moment de monter un projet carbone est le frein institutionnel. Comme énoncé précédemment avec les cas du Gabon, des projets peuvent se retrouver en conflit potentiel avec les engagements climatiques des pays et notamment les CDN. Cela peut entraîner un risque de double comptage des réductions d'émissions et ainsi la non-volonté des autorités à accepter que ces crédits soient vendus sur le marché volontaire. Cela peut donc freiner les investisseurs à développer des projets. Next, please. Pour faire face à cela, les gouvernements pourraient intégrer les réductions d'émissions automatiquement dans leur comptabilité nationale et prévoir un système de rétribution vers les porteurs de projets qui soit bien spécifique, organisé pour rassurer justement potentiellement ces investisseurs. Next, please. C'est ce qui notamment a été veut être défini dans le cas du Gabon, mais ces gouvernements ont besoin d'assistance pour établir ces stratégies qui sortent parfois de leur champ d'action. Next, please. Un autre frein est celui de la propriété des crédits carbone. En effet, ce sujet est très sensible dans la définition et la redistribution des crédits, surtout dans le contexte africain où les terres appartiennent à l'État et où l'État peut donc réclamer le revenu de ces crédits. Ce sont les États qui définissent évidemment leurs lois et la proportion à laquelle est reversée la part de ces crédits ou vendus. Dans certains cas, cela peut également freiner les porteurs de projets si ces définitions sont trop strictes ou qu'aucun accord entre les parties n'est possible. Ce sujet est toutefois très dépendant évidemment du pays concerné. Si l'on prend par exemple le cas du Congo où la réforme du code forestier en 2020 détaille très spécifiquement cette répartition des crédits, au Cameroun, par exemple, si des discussions sont en cours à l'heure actuelle, rien n'est encore défini sur ces questions. Next, please. Les institutions internationales devraient donc accompagner les gouvernements pour aider au dialogue avec les porteurs de projets, pour trouver des accords concernant cette question de propriété du carbone et les mécanismes de partage des revenus, et aborder les questions d'avantages fiscaux au montage de projets comme moyen incitatif. Pour conclure, le dernier point que je souhaitais soulever est aujourd'hui que le carbone est trop souvent associé comme le seul service écosystémique de référence des projets fondés sur la nature. Si vous pouvez revenir en arrière, s'il vous plaît. Yeah, again. Toutefois, les services écosystémiques de référence des projets de solutions fondées... toutefois, le carbone n'est et de loin pas le seul service écosystémique rendu par les forêts et la gestion durable. Il est essentiel de prendre en compte les bouquets de services rendus, qui ne sont pas limités uniquement à ceux qui sont représentés sur cette diapositive. De nombreuses initiatives se sont d'ailleurs lancées depuis quelques années, comme la norme 30006 de la certification FSC et certains standards volontaires qui prennent en compte ces services dans leur évaluation pour améliorer la valeur des crédits carbone vendus. De nouvelles opportunités existent donc pour les forestiers afin de diversifier leurs revenus par le biais de services écosystémiques. Cela passe notamment par la création de nouveaux systèmes de marché spécifiques à ces services, qui sont toutefois confrontés à certaines difficultés. En effet, la biodiversité, qui est une valeur qualitative, va avoir plus de mal à être représentée comme un crédit vis-à-vis du crédit carbone, qui est une valeur, une unité fixe, la tonne de CO2. Des initiatives, donc, next please, de ce type existent déjà pour créer des méthodologies qui soient compréhensibles, que ce soit du côté de Vera, du standard Vera, mais aussi du côté de l'UICN, qui travaille activement à l'élaboration d'un système de mesures basé sur la liste rouge des écosystèmes, ou encore la Coalition for Private Investment in Conservation, qui rédige actuellement un livre blanc sur l'émergence des crédits biodiversité et qui met actuellement aussi en place un groupe de travail pour réfléchir à ces questions. Il existe une initiative en France, l'Organisation for Biodiversity Conservation, qui cherche à développer des certificats biodiversité internationaux dont la Commission carbone et biodiversité de la TIBT fera partie très prochainement, ou encore une initiative du ministère des Eaux et Forêts du Gabon qui défend en ce moment même à la COP15 en Chine un projet de crédit biodiversité sur le modèle justement des crédits carbone. Ces mécanismes et initiatives ont donc besoin d'être accompagnés techniquement et financièrement pour voir le jour et offrir de nouvelles opportunités aux opérateurs forestiers. L'ITTO pourrait ainsi avoir un rôle à jouer dans ce cadre. Next, please. Pour conclure, il existe de nombreux défis pour les pays producteurs et les forestiers d'Afrique eux-mêmes, mais également pour ceux du monde entier, des autres régions tropicales, comme nous venons de le voir. Il est donc nécessaire que, via les institutions internationales telles que l'ITTO, des actions soient menées pour faciliter la connaissance de la totalité des acteurs sur la question des marchés et des projets carbone, aider à résoudre les limites aussi bien techniques qu'institutionnelles, pour faciliter la réalisation de projets et accompagner des initiatives visant à valoriser l'entièreté des services rendus par la forêt, qui ne se restreignent donc pas uniquement à leur capacité à stocker du carbone, mais bien plus que cela. Merci beaucoup à tous, à toutes et à tous pour votre attention.
Thank you, Pierre. Our next speaker is William Lectayo. Excuse me. William is a geographic engineer with specialty in environment and natural resources. He's a research professor at the Federico Villarreal National University in Lima. He's a GIS specialist on Ministry of Environment of Peru. William, please.
Ok. Buenas tardes con todos. Quiero, antes de iniciar la presentación, efectivamente hacer un agradecimiento a los organizadores de este evento por la invitación y en especial a la delegación peruana que ha confiado en mí para hacer estos alcances en base a una experiencia que ha tenido el Perú en obtener un primer inventario y un segundo inventario de carbono usando la tecnología de sensores remotos, especialmente las de LIDAR. También quiero agradecer al Ministerio del Ambiente y también a Greg Asner, investigador americano adscrito a la Universidad de Arizona. Gracias a una alianza que se formó en el pasado muy reciente, se logró desarrollar justamente la aplicación de estas tecnologías como uno de los primeros casos en el mundo en la que se desarrolla un inventario del stock de carbono en un país en su totalidad y a una alta resolución. Siguiente. Ya el embajador Portocarrero, en su discurso inicial de estas sesiones, ha comentado varias veces varias particularidades del Perú. Efectivamente, el Perú es el segundo país con mayor extensión en los bosques amazónicos y es un país megadiverso. Los 36 ecosistemas que oficialmente el Estado peruano ha reconocido están sirviendo para poder hacer una mejor gestión de los principales y numerosos servicios ecosistémicos que estos ecosistemas brindan en beneficio no solamente del mantenimiento de los ciclos biogeoquímicos en el país, sino también en beneficio de las poblaciones. Uno de los servicios ecosistémicos que efectivamente están reconocidos de manera oficial es el de la regulación y almacenamiento de carbono. Entonces, tener una información de detalle altamente preciso es importante para que justamente exista, si hablamos del mercado, que ahora han estado conversando mucho de esto, de tener una información precisa que permita justamente establecer la contabilidad necesaria y adecuada para esto. Siguiente, por favor. Aquí vemos, en la siguiente diapositiva, por favor, vemos el resultado, ¿no? El mapa de carbono, la geografía de carbono, como se le ha llamado, de un país que tiene que es como 128 millones de hectáreas, casi 3 veces o 2 veces la superficie de Francia y un poquito más de 3 veces la superficie del Japón, y una evaluación realizada con alta resolución. Cuando me refiero a la alta resolución, me estoy refiriendo que ha sido hecho y cuantificado la densidad del carbono aéreo por cada hectárea del país. Entonces, de acuerdo a los resultados de esta evaluación, el Perú tiene un stock de carbono de más o menos 6,9 pentagramos de carbono, o sea, más o menos cada pentagramo es 1 millón de toneladas de carbono almacenado. Y la densidad de carbono que está definido en el país va entre 50 y más de 150 megagramos de carbono por hectárea. Siguiente, por favor. Ahí podemos ver en cierto detalle, un acercamiento nada más de cómo es esta información. Cada hectárea de los 128 millones que tiene el país ha sido evaluado y cada hectárea tiene esa concentración o esa definición de su densidad, digamos, descrita en megagramos de carbono por hectárea. ¿Por qué es importante? Y vamos a la siguiente diapositiva. ¿Por qué es importante hablar de la hectárea? Creo que acá hemos escuchado varias veces que es importante la vinculación entre los compradores y los productores, y una manera de llegar a establecer una mayor integralidad justamente en la información es cuando hay una cuantificación de manera precisa en una superficie que es común de conversación y de entendimiento de todos, de los técnicos, de los tomadores de decisión, de la gente del campo. Una hectárea es normalmente una medida en que se establece la propiedad y la titularidad en el territorio. Entonces, por eso es la importancia y digamos, destacar el trabajo realizado en este sentido. Por supuesto que evaluar los bosques tropicales, en donde fácilmente podemos encontrar en una hectárea más de 600 árboles con diámetros a la altura de nuestro pecho de más de 10 centímetros, es muy difícil hacerlo en campo para toda una superficie tan grande como un país. Y aquí es donde entra a tallar la utilización y la aplicación de la tecnología, y especialmente la tecnología de sensores remotos, y en este caso particular el uso de LIDAR, que es un aspecto importante a destacar. Siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Otro elemento que quiero destacar sobre el proceso mediante el cual se llevó a cabo esta información. La siguiente diapositiva, si fueran tan amables. Gracias. Es el enfoque, ¿no? El enfoque de aplicación de estas tecnologías. Aquí podemos destacar 3 aspectos principales. Número 1, el uso de las imágenes satelitales, que son gratuitas por lo general, pero también del análisis automatizado que se puede hacer de ellas para poder cuantificar la actividad fotosintética que se da en los bosques. Esto es muy importante porque permite establecer una mejor estratificación de los bosques con la finalidad de poder planificar adecuadamente el levantamiento de la información. En segundo lugar, justamente el uso de la tecnología LIDAR, es decir, el uso de los pulsos láser que permiten cuantificar la altura de los árboles y permiten caracterizar la estructura del bosque con esta información. Y en tercer lugar, el uso de los algoritmos de análisis que pueden integrar justamente la información de los satélites y de la información de los pulsos láser a través del LIDAR, a través de un análisis geoestadístico de aprendizaje de máquina, ¿no? Siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Bien, cuando me refería a esta tecnología, estamos hablando de que un sensor LIDAR por lo menos lanza casi un poco más de 500.000 pulsos por segundo. Esta luz llega a impactar sobre toda la superficie del dosel del bosque, llega a penetrar a través del bosque, incluso en el suelo. El rebote que esto genera produce información muy importante. Si hacemos un siguiente, por favor. Ahí podemos tener las principales métricas que se pueden obtener a través del uso de estos sensores, ¿no? La altura de los árboles, la estructura de los árboles y la superficie debajo de los árboles, ¿no? Siguiente, por favor. ¿No? La imagen que ustedes ven ahí es el resultado justamente de la utilización de estos sensores, ¿no? Ahí podemos ver, parece una fotografía de los bosques, pero es en realidad el resultado de la interacción entre las señales de láser y el tiempo que tarda en rebotar en la superficie y llegar a ser registrado en el sensor. Siguiente diapositiva. Simplemente para mencionar que aquí se obtienen dos tipos de resultados importantes, ¿no? Todo lo que se denomina el modelo de superficie, es decir, las partes superficiales o digamos, sí, el tope de las copas de los árboles y también todo lo que es la base del terreno, ¿no? Siguiente diapositiva. Ok, aquí podemos ver o podemos apreciar el equipamiento que se utilizó para poder lograr este inventario en el país. Siguiente diapositiva. Ok, ahí podemos ver cuáles son los artefactos que se emplearon en esta oportunidad. Un clic, por favor. Next. Ahí podemos ver, esto es un espectrómetro hiperespectral de más de 428 bandas. Siguiente. Ese es el siguiente, por favor. Nada más. Ahí tenemos el sensor LIDAR. Y siguiente. Tenemos un sensor multiespectral que en combinación, si damos siguiente, por favor. La integración de estos tres elementos, ¿no?, que fue parte del trabajo realizado en el país, ya permite obtener una información mucho más allá de simplemente una visión óptica de las cosas, de los bosques. Ahí podemos apreciar no solamente la estructura del bosque, la altura de los árboles, sino también las características químicas que están presentes en estos árboles. Esta información ha servido también para poder obtener otro mapa adicional, que no es motivo de esta presentación, pero que tiene que ver con la medición de la diversidad funcional de los bosques. Siguiente. Bueno, ya comenté sobre esto, ahí podemos apreciar el punto número A, que es la altura de los árboles, el punto número B, que es la estructura de los árboles, y el punto número C, que se refiere básicamente al barrido que puede hacer estos sensores si están montados en una plataforma aérea o sobre una plataforma espacial. Siguiente. La calibración de los datos del LIDAR, ¿no?, con respecto a las reservas de carbono ha sido ya bastante estudiado justamente por Greg Gansner en años pasados. La relación que hay una alta relación entre los datos de las alturas de los árboles medidos con el sensor LIDAR y las estimaciones de stock de carbono medidos en el terreno. Siguiente diapositiva. para que se pueda lograr esta información a nivel de todo el territorio nacional en el Perú y ahorrar, digamos, como ahí se dice, tiempo y dinero en la construcción de este mapa, se ha tenido que establecer un conjunto de relaciones físicas, digamos así, en el territorio. Ahí podemos apreciar en el mapa número A, digamos, una estratificación lograda a través de diferentes datos de información conjuntamente con el de las alturas. Ahí se ha podido demostrar que hay controles geográficos o controles ambientales que más o menos explican más del 75% de la variación de la densidad de carbono que se puede encontrar en los bosques tropicales. La cobertura de los árboles, la precipitación, la actividad fotosintética en los de los bosques, más o menos explican el 75% de esa variación de la densidad de los bosques o del carbono en los bosques tropicales. Siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Asimismo, para que pueda establecerse esa relación entre los datos que obtiene el sensor y los datos de campo, se establecieron alrededor de 272 parcelas de campo permanentes en el territorio, como pueden ustedes apreciar ahí. Muchos de ellos representan bosques primarios, bosques secundarios, bosques intervenidos a través de tala ilegal y también, digamos, combinaciones de bosques secundarios con actividad agrícola. Pero lo importante aquí es que a partir de esta selección de parcelas de campo ha sido posible calibrar los datos del IDA para poder luego, a través del análisis de los algoritmos, para poder escalar justamente la información a todo el territorio del país en función de las densidades de carbono. Siguiente diapositiva. En la siguiente diapositiva, ustedes van a poder apreciar la malla, o la red, mejor dicho, de datos sobrevolados en el territorio peruano, de los datos LIDAR. Ahí podemos ver en la figura número A todos los vuelos que se hicieron para poder tomar estos datos en el terreno. Y al lado derecho lo que ustedes pueden apreciar es la manera en cómo se definió una representación estadísticamente consistente para que cada cuadrillado que está ahí en la figura número B pueda tener una representación al menos mínima del 2% de datos del LIDAR tomados por cada cuadrícula. Es a partir de esa información que se hace la relación entre ambos datos para poder generar la información de los datos de carbono. Siguiente. No me voy a detener mucho en esto porque es algo casi lo que habíamos repetido en una lámina anterior. Las estimaciones finalmente para el mapa de carbono del Perú, establecidos a través de las parcelas en el terreno, han establecido justamente una alta relación entre los datos tomados por LIDAR y los contenidos de carbono en las parcelas de campo que se determinaron. Siguiente diapositiva. Bueno, y ahí ustedes ven, por ejemplo, el resultado, ¿no?, que ya lo vimos al principio. Habría que decir que en el Perú, más o menos la densidad media de carbono por hectárea, en general es de 99 megagramos de carbono por cada hectárea. Hay una máxima de carbono aéreo o de densidad de carbono aéreo que es de 167.6, pero más del 50% de todos los bosques albergan densidades mayores a 100 megagramos de carbono, aunque solamente el 10% de ese total sobrepasa los 125 megagramos de carbono. Esa es la realidad. Entonces, ahí estamos hablando de densidades de carbono por hectárea. Sí, ya el stock de carbono a nivel de todo el país es, como dije al principio, se contabiliza en 6,9 pentagramos de carbono. También al lado derecho ustedes pueden apreciar un mapa que ha calculado por hectárea la incertidumbre. Eso también es muy importante porque eso finalmente tiene que ver mucho con la precisión que tiene esta información en este ejercicio. Si ustedes se dan cuenta, una evaluación de todo un país que determina el stock de carbono tiene también calculado la incertidumbre contabilizada para saber efectivamente cuál es el grado de certidumbre que tiene la información. Siguiente, por favor. Esto es un poco más de lo mismo. Yo creo que mejor avanzo para poder entrar a esta siguiente diapositiva. Siguiente, por favor. Que es ese balance general del cual se desprenden algunos aspectos importantes. Siguiente diapositiva. Ahí podemos apreciar algunas cosas que podemos extraer de ahí. Es lo siguiente, ¿no? Que en cuanto al, digamos, el mantenimiento y mejoramiento de los stocks de carbono en un país como en el Perú, está sujeto a amenazas, como también hay, digamos, decisiones en un ordenamiento territorial que permite la protección o conservación del carbono almacenado en los bosques amazónicos, y también hay oportunidades para poder desarrollar un conjunto de acciones en el futuro. Ahí podemos apreciar que un total de 1,82 pentagramos están almacenados en áreas naturales protegidas, es decir, que el Estado peruano, a través de la gestión de las áreas naturales protegidas, está preservando alrededor de 1,82 pentagramos de carbono. Eso significa más o menos el 26% del territorio del país. Y eso también significa que un 74% del stock de carbono está fuera de las áreas naturales protegidas. Fuera de las áreas protegidas, las comunidades nativas más o menos están asegurando o están protegiendo alrededor de 0,84 pentagramos de carbono, y otras modalidades de conservación privada principalmente protegen alrededor de 0,17 pentagramos de carbono. Amenazas a la conservación, al mantenimiento de del ciclo de carbono y el almacenamiento, y este servicio ecosistémico del almacenamiento de carbono en el país, tiene que ver, por ejemplo, con la minería ilegal, tiene que ver con la deforestación de la agricultura migratoria, tiene que ver con algunas asignaciones de uso, como por ejemplo las de hidrocarburos, que en cierta manera ponen en riesgo la conservación de esos stocks. Estamos hablando que 2,34 pentagramos de carbono pueden estar sujetos a este tipo de riesgo. Y esto es importante saber porque aquí también estamos hablando digamos, de establecer medidas de ordenamiento sostenible, y tiene que ver mucho entonces con las decisiones de ver qué cosas hacemos con estas amenazas. Pero también así como hay amenazas, también hay oportunidades. Existe la oportunidad de evitar las emisiones de carbono al establecer de repente categorías territoriales adicionales a las que ya se han establecido. Y eso tiene que ver, y el mapa que les he presentado ayuda mucho a eso, porque hay que definir de manera, digamos, utilizando la información biogeográfica de los ecosistemas, poder determinar en qué ámbitos se pueden considerar algunas otras áreas de conservación, aun cuando en el país, en el Perú, ya no se pretende aumentar el número de áreas naturales protegidas. Pero también hay otra oportunidad. Aproximadamente 13 millones de hectáreas que están alrededor de las áreas deforestadas presentan indicadores de fragmentación. Eso significa que no han pasado a ser deforestación, pero que de alguna otra manera están siendo perturbadas por diferentes procesos internos que se dan en los bosques. Tala selectiva, ingresos para aprovechamiento de diferente índole, pero de alguna otra manera se han podido medir que son 13 millones de hectáreas que están fragmentadas. Eso no es un problema en sí mismo, sino puede ser una oportunidad en la medida que esta puede ser la superficie que puede estar sujeto a los procesos de restauración forestal. Desde el punto de vista geográfico, también hay otra oportunidad. Hay regiones que todavía no están, digamos, que tienen cierto contenido de carbono importante y que requieren ser gestionadas. Me estoy refiriendo, por ejemplo, a las regiones submontanas de la Amazonía, como en el caso de Loreto, en las que alrededor de 0,3 pentagramos de carbono pueden estar sujetos a un proceso de gestión sostenible del territorio. Y efectivamente, si queremos evitar más emisiones y llegar a un balance de carbono neutro, digamos así, depende de reducir no solamente las emisiones brutas, sino también de promover la absorción de carbono, ¿no? Y a eso nos referíamos, o me refiero a los proyectos que permitan justamente regenerar y aumentar el almacenamiento de carbono. Siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Ya casi para terminar, el Perú se vio beneficiado en el 2014 con este inventario que hemos señalado, utilizando LIDAR y utilizando las imágenes satelitales. Y en el 2017 para el 2018 tuvimos la suerte de tener una nueva oportunidad de poder actualizar la información del carbono en el país. Esto ya fue una asociación, una alianza entre Planet, que como no podemos conocer, algunos de repente no, pero Planet es una corporación que tiene un sistema satelital de más de 180 satélites que están constantemente evaluando el territorio. Y la Universidad de Arizona, donde justamente actualmente trabaja el doctor Asner, con el cual han desarrollado un nuevo inventario actualizado. En este caso, reduciendo los costos, porque ya se cuenta con, en el Perú por lo menos ya se cuenta con toda la red de datos de LIDAR evaluados, y en donde ya se ha utilizado imágenes de alta resolución para poder actualizar la información de carbono en el país, a un bajo costo. Siguiente diapositiva. Ahí podemos avanzar, por favor. Ya, ok. Una más. Y ahí vemos el resultado de esa evaluación. Siguiente. Ya para finalizar, y no menos importante, quería terminar con esto. He hablado de que en el caso de Perú se utilizó LIDAR aéreo transportado, o sea, portado en un avión. Pero desde hace algunos años también ya hay un sistema LIDAR que está cargado en una plataforma satelital. Lo menciono porque con esto hay un problema también, porque si bien es cierto, este sistema satelital de LIDAR que da información para todo el mundo, por lo cual los diferentes países se pueden beneficiar para poder lograr un inventario como el que yo he explicado actualmente. Sin embargo, este programa está cerrando. Entonces hay todo un movimiento actualmente de investigadores, las diferentes organizaciones a nivel mundial que están tratando de solicitar que este programa no termine. No porque el sensor ha caducado, sino porque simplemente ha acabado el periodo de ejecución de este programa. Entonces, de repente, desde aquí también se puede alzar una voz para poder empujar a que este programa continúe y se siga beneficiando con esta información a los diferentes países. Con eso quiero terminar. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, William. Our next speaker will be Nicholas Butcher.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator, and thank you to the ITTO for giving me the opportunity to share with you today, and thank you to all of those of you listening for taking the time to hear about what we've been doing in New Zealand. I hope that the progress that we've made there within the New Zealand carbon markets is potentially one that can be repeated in other countries within the ITTO to bring the same benefits. Next slide, please. So an overview of what I'm going to speak to you about today. The first is a quick recap of New Zealand's NDC goals under the Paris Agreement and the role of forest and forest restoration within those goals. And then I'll speak briefly about the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme and the incentives that that has within for the forest sector to help drive progress towards those NDCs. I'll then get into the issues within the New Zealand ETS regarding forestry that we realised when looking into it and working with landholders, and the approach that we took to try and help resolve those issues to increase participation within the carbon markets within New Zealand and drive additional forest restoration. I'll then go into the details of how we approach that issue by applying artificial intelligence and remote sensing data along with automation and the benefit that this had in reducing market friction and maximising the effectiveness of the program. This is an approach that we feel is likely repeatable across regions with diverse forms of forest worldwide. Next slide, please. So New Zealand is a consumer member of the ITTO. However, New Zealand does have a large domestic temperate forest area. You can see the approximate split here. Roughly 30% of our land area is indigenous forest. 8% of our land area is exotic forest, which is primarily managed as a timber resource production forest. And like all nations, New Zealand's forest is both a responsibility for the country and also an opportunity for the country. And that's very true in the context of biodiversity and timber, but also in the context of climate change mitigation and carbon markets. Next slide, please. I won't go into the details here of the exact carbon budgets, but New Zealand's goal under its NDC is presently to reduce net emissions by 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. In order to achieve this, we intend a combination of domestic emissions reductions, domestic carbon sequestration, primarily in forest, and the potential of offshore purchases of transferable mitigation outcomes, as Selena spoke of. This chart that you can see here shows just how important the forest sequestration resource is. Land use change and forestry is currently a 23.3 megatonne carbon sink, which is roughly 30% of New Zealand's total gross emissions. So the incentives that we have in place should maintain and increase that sink in order for us to make progress towards our goals for climate change mitigation. Next slide, please. For the purposes of UNFCCC, 100% of New Zealand's forest estate is considered managed forest. And for NDC accounting, we follow effectively the same as the Kyoto model, where for pre-1990 established forest, changes in carbon stocks of that forest are credited versus a forest reference level. And for land established as forest after 1989, all of the changes in carbon stock can be credited against the greenhouse gas inventory, which means that progress against our targets requires managing the pre-1990 forest cover to maximise carbon stock and minimise deforestation, and managing and extending the post-1989 forest cover to maximise carbon stock. And this is not to say that those goals should be pursued at the expense of all else. There are obviously many other factors that need to be considered in terms of land use and food security, etc. But to the extent that we are pursuing increasing our forest carbon sink, that's how we look to achieve it. I'll come to this natural and planted forest plot network in some more detail later on, but this is the network that the New Zealand government has established, and it supports both our international reporting for progress in terms of LULUCF and also the domestic emissions trading scheme for forestry and supporting an accurate monitoring framework within that. Next slide, please. So to achieve this outcome with market mechanisms requires aligned incentives, and there's two key elements. The first is a robust framework for recognising forest carbon sequestration outcomes, which landowners or forest owners achieve. And the second is a market that provides a way to turn those sequestration outcomes into money, which can drive an economic response, ideally to increase the sequestration outcomes, being more carbon sunk or more CO2 credits issued. Next slide, please. Much of the opportunity for additional carbon sequestration in forest within New Zealand or the establishment of new forest is on land that is held by private landholders, which means that a system needs to be in place to allow those landholders to register and access these incentives. This requires them to register their forest and then perform ongoing monitoring and verification of the outcomes achieved with that forest. This is done within the New Zealand emissions trading scheme in New Zealand, which is run by the government regulator who sets the rules and targets the progress towards the international NDC goals. By registering with the New Zealand emissions trading scheme, landholders can, if they achieve sufficient forest outcomes, receive New Zealand carbon units called NZUs, and they can then sell, as the critical step, these units into a local compliance market through secondary market mechanisms to carbon emitters who have compliance obligations to offset their emissions within that market, and they can then receive payment. Next slide, please. In many respects, the scheme has been extremely successful. There are almost 400,000 hectares of post-89 forest registered within the scheme, and it's estimated that approximately 13 million tonnes of CO2 sequestration will occur in 2022, with the resulting transfer of almost $600 million worth of carbon credits at the current prices. This very much represents a success. However, if we look at some of the things that haven't happened, we can also identify some of the further opportunities for progress. Next slide, please. When we began to work with landholders with the potential for registering forest within this scheme, we identified that only 55% of the estimated eligible forest was enrolled in the scheme. Mixed land use participants, which is to say landholders who have a combination of production forestry and indigenous forestry and farmland, have the most potential to increase sequestration, but they also had the lowest engagement rates within the scheme. Similarly, indigenous biodiverse forests are the highest policy priority in terms of the Climate Change Commission's goals within New Zealand, but they also had the lowest registration rates versus their area and were generally under-incentivised. Next slide, please. The key challenges that we identified are very similar. Can we jump to the next slide, please? Thank you. The issues that we identified in particular were the complexity of the registration and compliance processes from the perspective of these landowners, and the uncertainty that they had around the carbon yields and hence revenue that they might receive, and the monitoring processes that they would have to put in place. And these challenges were the most prevalent for areas of forest for mixed land use, as I mentioned before, and for high biodiversity forest with a large variety of mixed species representation, and for mixed management forest. Next slide, please. We've implemented a portfolio of solutions combining artificial intelligence and remote sensing data, along with handcrafted region-specific rules engines, and combined these with land ownership and boundary information available from the New Zealand land records to give every forest owner a customised assessment of the opportunity within the market and detail the process that they can go through in order to access the incentives and the market mechanisms. Next slide, please. At the core of this technology is vegetation assessment using remote sensing data. Our system is able to estimate the species, height, density and growth over time of these areas of forests, primarily from aerial imagery, in much the same way as you saw a moment ago in William's presentation. And I'll now run through some details of what we can do and how. Next slide, please. In order to accurately estimate the carbon sequestration rates, which are generally what is credited within these schemes, you need to have a good understanding of the combination of species within the area and the state of progression of those species and the carbon sequestration rates of these species. Doing this through manual processes at very large scales is extremely labour intensive and prone to error. The processes that we have put in place allow the implementation of this in a largely automated manner based on very limited initial ground truth plots, which means that it can be deployed in a new area with a relatively low upfront investment and infrastructure requirement. You can see here the performance of the algorithms across 3 different species classes using ground truth points established remotely within the area. This is just for species classification, but you can see that it does a good job of differentiating between the exotic species, which in this case is Pinus radiata, indigenous regenerating forest within the area, and gorse, which is a form of woody biomass. But this approach is extensible to any arbitrary combination of species in any form of forest with the approach that we use. Next slide, please. Once you have the basic species mixes for most of the monitoring mechanisms, you need to establish vegetation boundaries within the area. This is the stratification, which William also spoke of. The output of this is the raw vegetation state so that you can draw a boundary around the key areas that you're interested in. And from those boundaries, you can then look to apply the regional rules which may exist for any given country under the UNFCCC guidelines. And I'll speak to those in the next slide. However, one of the key points that we're quite proud of as a company is that we achieve a 92% pixel level accuracy for vegetation segmentation across a given area, which based on the benchmarking we have done within New Zealand at least, is beyond state of the art. Next slide, please. So it might seem strange to speak of vegetation in forest. However, there are many forms of vegetation that do not qualify as forest, and the definition of forest here comes down to the rules that the particular country has chosen to apply. At least up until recently with the Kyoto reporting, in New Zealand this meant a forest has to be an area of vegetation which is of more than 1 hectare and of greater than 30 metres average width and of greater than 30% average canopy cover, with the potential to grow to more than 5 metres height at maturity. Anything that doesn't qualify for that does not count as forest in terms of claims under in contributions towards NDCs. However, vegetation aggregates which do meet that contribute to the carbon inventory. And here you can see the process. We take first just the raw estimations of vegetation type, then we bridge the gaps to create polygons, then we simplify those polygons, and then we classify those polygons based on eligibility. And this can be applied for any arbitrary rule set based on a particular country's goals. Next slide, please. Once you have the forest areas, the thing that's actually credited is not the presence or absence of forest in carbon markets, nor even necessarily the carbon stock, but depending on the scheme, some combination of the carbon stock, which is the number of tonnes of carbon that are there stored in the biomass, and the carbon sequestration rate, which is given usually in a value of tonnes per year, and that's how much carbon is actually being removed from the atmosphere, or in the case of emissions, emitted to the atmosphere. Within the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, these carbon units are issued based on standard species group carbon stock and sequestration rate tables developed by the government and the various ministries. These are calibrated with the National Monitoring Network, which I mentioned before, maintained by the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry for Primary Industries. There are custom rates based on sampling within the particular landholders' forests for larger areas of forests. Next slide, please. Within carbon crop, we have developed and are developing a high-resolution carbon stock map informed by these sampling plots and models from the government system. And this allows us to have sequestration profiles at very high resolution from standard remote sensing data. And by high resolution in this case, I mean single square metre levels. That's not to say that we are perfectly precise within a single square metre, but at a sort of small area it becomes quite accurate. And the key point is that this allows you to credit or discredit carbon sequestration at very high resolutions in association with perhaps local deforestation. If a single tree falls down within an area, you want to be able to have that reflected in the carbon stock and the sequestration rate for that area so that you can align incentives appropriately. The process by which we do this combines our species cluster similarity metrics, which I spoke of before, existing allometric models, either general ones or country-specific ones, existing ground truth calibration data, and then ongoing field measurement data. We're also incorporating an expanding set of environment data, which has a significant impact on the carbon sequestration rate. This includes such things as temperature, local topography, altitude, rainfall, and soil type, and many other factors. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, for our species model, this approach can be applied across regions, assuming the presence of those various inputs. It does require an initial approximate allometric and growth model for the forest, for the categories for which carbon sequestration rates are desired to be monitored. The key point, though, is that it is specifically designed to integrate additional monitoring data over time to improve accuracy, and it begins at a conservative estimate level, which means that you do not need to have a perfect understanding of every aspect of your forest to begin to use the system and integrate it into a crediting scheme. You can start at sort of a lower level with more conservative estimates and then improve over time, which is key to removing barriers to initial projects. Next slide, please. One of the key things that scalable carbon markets require is high integrity, as has been spoken about in detail, and we do not have the universal solution to high integrity. However, there are a couple of technical elements which we have emphasised in our solution. Next slide, please. And these are designed to enable three key elements, being the transparency in terms of the data and the sequestration rates that are being assessed, the traceability of any given carbon unit that is issued. It has to be able to be traced back to an individual area of forest for the avoidance of double counting or double crediting. And finally, the auditability for similar purposes. If you're going to sell this instrument and have someone buy that for the basis of a carbon neutrality claim, somebody else needs to be able to verify that carbon neutrality claim by inspecting the origins of the unit and be able to trace it right back through. And these are key both for national market integrity and for international market integrity, whether within the voluntary carbon markets or compliance carbon markets or markets under the Paris Article 6 system. Next slide, please. We have implemented a solution using some of our technologies for this, for the purposes of a voluntary carbon market solution within New Zealand. We can segment any given property up into smaller component elements, estimate the carbon stocks and sequestration rates within that property, provide a projection of the future carbon sequestration rates, both on expected growth profiles to the landholder, and then tokenise that carbon sequestration into tradable elements which can be traceable back to their origin. And for those, we track issuance, ownership, and transactions, and can integrate with third-party elements. Now, these are not all necessarily elements that we would provide for any given project, because in many cases, mature frameworks such as, or maturing frameworks such as domestic carbon markets, or the systems being put in place for RED or Paris Article 6 will already have these in place. And we don't intend to substitute those, but for national carbon markets, where they are not available, this provides a potential framework for development. Next slide, please. Here's another example. We developed a tool for this domestic carbon market, which we call Carbon Tracer, and this supports the traceability, transparency, and auditability elements. The key being that if a carbon offset buyer, even the buyer of a single individual tonne of carbon looking to perhaps offset a flight, wants to be able to trace where that tonne of carbon came from and verify that it's not duplicated elsewhere, they can do so by entering the unique identifier into our platform and then seeing the forest that it's associated with and the history of that forest and the sequestration associated with that forest. Next slide, please. But if anything, the bigger lesson that we learned within the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme was that these scalable markets require accessibility. And if they're not accessible, as Pierre talked about in great detail, it becomes very difficult for the incentives to actually have any effect, because the people who are able to take action can't get paid for them. Here again is just a single example of one of the tools we created. Reports can be built for the owner of any given area of forest, generated automatically from the vegetation data that we've assessed for that forest. And this tells them the different classes of forest they have within their area, the assessed sequestration rates, the potential financial returns. And because we've done this in an automated way, we can provide these to landholders for free within the New Zealand market, which means that for no upfront investment, they can get the details of their potential returns, and that allows them to make an informed decision about whether to progress with the project. Next slide, please. Finally, in terms of the technology, we've developed a fairly broad suite of online tooling. And the key of this, I won't go into the details, but this is an example of one of our larger projects where the landholder's expecting a return of several $1 million per year. Because it's an online tool and all parties can have access to it, they can quickly get a shared context of what the opportunity is and what the expectations are, so that any decision that's made is made with full knowledge. Next slide, please. So we're roughly 1 year on from the launch of this system now, and it's had a significant positive impact within New Zealand. Next slide, please. We've added approximately 13,000 hectares of forest within the emissions trading scheme, which is relatively small within the context of the scheme overall. But specifically to note, almost 80% of our registrations have been of high biodiversity native forest, and that represents roughly a 25% increase in the total registered high biodiversity forest area within a single year by us versus the total registered within the scheme up until this point. And this will result in the payout of roughly 30 million New Zealand dollars, which is approximately 20 million US dollars, to landholders for carbon early next year. Next slide, please. Sorry, I forgot to say next slide. This was the slide I was just speaking to. Next slide again, please. And the next slide again, please. So it's our view that these same technologies that we have developed and applied successfully within New Zealand could be applied to support high integrity forest carbon markets in any region. It's not to say that the entire portfolio of solutions will be directly applicable, but we're very interested to hear of the problems that those of you working and searching for solutions within these markets are having, and how you see our technologies could prove valuable. Next slide, please. And we'd very much welcome the opportunity to collaborate with the ITTO and any member country to develop these solutions to apply to tropical forest. Next slide, please. I'd just like to thank you all very much for your time and your attention. My contact details are here, and I'll be available later on over the course of this week for any discussions if you're interested in more details. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. 21 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard 5 presentations. They're all very good. I will now open the floor for questions, and I also invite our online viewers to ask questions. The usual way, you have to raise your hand. At least I hope I can see your hand. The floor is open for questions. Just to remind the online viewers, you can ask questions. Please raise your hand too. We will start with the questions from this room. I recognize distinguished delegate of Peru.
Gracias, señor presidente. Voy a tratar de ser bastante breve porque el tiempo se ha vuelto bastante corto. En primer lugar, para agradecer y felicitar a los 5 expositores, a Celina, Iván, Pierre, William y Nick por sus excelentes presentaciones. Creo que nos han dado una magnífica información y una lección de los avances que existen con relación a los estudios de carbono, las dificultades de presentación de los proyectos, la necesidad de una mejor capacitación, un intercambio de información. También, bueno, son temas bastante complejos que requieren mucho más tiempo. Ojalá que en una próxima reunión del Consejo se dé una oportunidad de tiempo de discusión mucho más amplia de la que tenemos en este momento, porque tenemos una agenda todavía bastante recargada que sigue en la tarde, y este tema que nos convoca ahora pues merece probablemente dedicarle todo un día, porque son temas centrales de la institución, de la organización, así como el tema que hemos visto anteriormente de la información sobre mercado. Creo que hay necesidad de promover el diálogo, la discusión, las negociaciones en el seno de esta institución, y ojalá que una próxima oportunidad pues se dé mucho más tiempo a la discusión. En segundo lugar, mis observaciones en el sentido de que del tema del carbono, pues ya con la presentación de Celina y luego de los otros consultores, pues se ve que son temas bastante complejos, pero al mismo tiempo existen muy buenas experiencias. Estamos viendo las experiencias que nos presentó Pierre en el caso del África, del Congo, de la cuenca del Congo, la presentación que nos hace Iván sobre las experiencias del mercado voluntario de carbono en el Brasil, el desarrollo de la mafificación de carbono en el Perú, etcétera, que pueden perfectamente dar lugar a un intercambio de experiencias, a una cooperación sur-sur. Tenemos, yo creo que elementos tecnológicos, desarrollos muy buenos a nivel de nuestros países. Aprovechemos esta oportunidad de hacer un intercambio, una cooperación sur-sur que refuerce nuestra coordinación, nuestra participación a nivel de nuestras regiones. Y en tercer lugar, creo que es muy importante desarrollar un programa de capacitación donde la ITO, por ejemplo, con una alianza desarrollada con el PNUD y con Nueva Zelanda, que tiene mucha experiencia en esto, y con las presentaciones que hemos recibido, desarrolla todo un programa de capacitación que lo estamos necesitando, difundir estas tecnologías, hacerlas bajarlas un poco al suelo en niveles que puedan ser más entendibles, sobre todo para las comunidades, para los pequeños propietarios o operadores del bosque, que es tremendamente importante. Este es un reto que creo que nuestra organización debe tomar e iniciar lo más pronto posible, pues un programa articulado de comunicación, de intercambio sur-sur, de cooperación y de capacitación. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Peru. We take note of your request for no more time for debate on this topic in the next session. We also take note of your request that there should be more South-South exchange of technical cooperation. And lastly, we take note of your request for a training program to help our members. Malaysia, silakan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for all the speakers. It is indeed very interesting and a lot to learn about the relationship between what's going on in UNFCCC as well as what ITTO is doing here. And I would like to echo the views expressed by the delegation from Peru, basically that we do need more time to discuss these issues. A lot more training is required, capacity building for us in the forestry sector, basically, to understand more what is going on in the other side of the spectrum with regard to carbon trading and all this discussions about carbon. And I have hundreds of questions, but I think I need to limit to only one. Basically, it's a very basic question with regard to the definition of forest. I noted, I think in the presentation by Nick, that you use a different definition for forest under this carbon trading in New Zealand. I wonder whether you have a different definition used in New Zealand. And I also note a different definition is used under EUDR. So I wonder if we could have, some sort of a common definition of forest. I mean, we have been using FAO definition all the while, but and now there is a different definition used under UNFCCC. Who actually, accept, or is there any way that we can actually have a common term used in terms of how do we define forests with regard to carbon trading, or any other initiatives, whether there is a need, or there's something that I need to understand as well. How does New Zealand come up with this different definition of forest under this initiative? Thank you.
Thank you, Malaysia. I will ask Nick for his comments. Nick, please.
I should first clarify that definition of forest is the one that was used by New Zealand under the Kyoto Agreement. I'm not sure whether it remains valid in its same exact form under the Paris Agreement, but I believe it's similar. It is based on parameters that are standardized within the UNFCCC for forest, and basically every country can choose for the four major variables I mentioned: area, height at maturity, canopy cover, and average width. There was a sort of a scale that countries could choose from for the definition of forest that would apply for their obligations under Kyoto. So I think that is well codified within the UNFCCC. I think it is only really has that relevance within that framework. It's not intended to force a certain definition of forest for other purposes, such as, I'm not sure of the many applications of forest, but I think most countries that are considering their forests within Kyoto would have picked parameters there. Certainly I know several that have. But I don't know that it's intended for any use beyond that. I can't speak with any authority on it.
Thank you, Nick. I recognize the distinguished delegate of Togo.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais remercier tous les présentateurs pour la qualité de leur présentation. Et à travers leur présentation, il y a des éléments techniques sur l'évaluation du carbone au niveau de leurs différents pays. Mais moi, je voudrais m'intéresser dans un premier temps au cadre législatif. Et je ne sais pas, parce que pour moi, tout part de là. Est-ce qu'au niveau de ces différents pays, est-ce qu'il y a des cadres législatifs adaptés, par exemple au partage de bénéfices tel que quelqu'un l'a dit dans sa présentation, parce que tout part de là. Quand on parle de marché carbone, est-ce que ces pays se sont dotés des outils juridiques qui puissent encadrer ce marché, par exemple? Parce que pour nous, nous disons que c'est l'élément primordial à partir duquel on doit pouvoir opérer et encadrer tout ce qui va se faire. Est-ce que ces pays sont dotés déjà de ce cadre-là? Je voulais savoir.
Thank you, Togo. I will ask for comments from Pierre and also from Nick because he has obviously been trading in New Zealand, so that's his comments. But before I ask for the comments, I'd like to share one little bit of information. We have 5 speakers here today. There's a number 6 speaker who cannot make it. The number 6 speaker is actually a gentleman from the Malaysian state of Sarawak. What is interesting is that in Sarawak, they have just changed the forestry law and the land law to incorporate carbon so that it is clear for investors when they come to Sarawak that their investment will be protected. So it is a very interesting development because Sarawak is going to go for carbon in a very big way. Unfortunately, the gentleman cannot be with us here today. Nevertheless, we have experts on my right who will be able to share some information. So, Pierre, please.
Merci pour cette question. Alors, concernant les cadres législatifs, justement, pour les pays, notamment pour reprendre les exemples des pays africains, comme je le reprenais dans la présentation, certains pays ont défini au sein de leur loi, effectivement, des cadres juridiques encadrant la redistribution et la propriété des crédits carbone, tels que la République du Congo, par exemple, qui a dans son code forestier, sa révision du code forestier de 2020, a clairement détaillé cette répartition et le porteur de projet comme propriétaire des crédits carbone. D'autres pays, je le reprenais également comme exemple, le Cameroun, travaille à l'heure actuelle justement sur cette définition, mais à l'heure actuelle, rien n'est défini dans les lois du pays. Généralement, la majorité de ces pays travaillent justement à une définition de ce cadre législatif, mais pour le moment, cela est réalisé indépendamment pour chaque pays. Peut-être qu'une définition commune via un échange entre les pays pourrait être envisagée pour définir justement un cadre plus général et peut-être favoriser justement la mobilisation d'investisseurs, de porteurs de projets à générer des projets. Mais à l'heure actuelle, voilà, ce sont des projets définis État par État individuellement.
Thank you, Pierre. Nicholas?
Yes, I can speak only to the best of my knowledge based on our experience of the New Zealand legislation and our operating within that legislation in the market. So there is a legal structure in place for this within New Zealand. The Climate Change Response Act codifies the responsibilities of landholders and their entitlements to carbon. Generally within that, the owner of the land is the entity that can register with and claim credits for the carbon sequestration. And I appreciate that this is an issue that's not so controversial within New Zealand because we have extremely accurate land ownership records that are generally uncontested and reasonably well resolved in terms of issues of ownership. So that's for the compliance market. It's very well resolved, including the entitlement to credits and the ongoing obligations. Within the voluntary carbon market in New Zealand, there is no formal regulation or laws that I'm aware of. There are guidelines for best practice, and both of these are being continually refined and evolved to try and align the actual outcomes with the policy goals.
May I add?
Selena, please.
Thank you. And just to add to the very good responses that have been given. So thinking about countries that have spent 10, 12 years working on national RED Plus strategies and what they would do with the results-based payments as well as other performance payments or finance that they have received. Very often, as part of the strategy or the package of works, they will look at sometimes that's called a use of proceeds mechanisms or benefit sharing mechanisms, right? And for some of these, what we have seen in other countries, while they may not be legislated, it could be a standard operating procedure, or it could be another policy or a guideline that supplements what already exists legislatively. And for a lot of these, we've seen the countries decide, for some of these proceeds, we will focus on programs or projects that have or that will continue to generate both carbon and non-carbon benefits. And for some of these, in some of the countries, this will go back to better forestry practices. Some of these will go to the communities in the form of community forestry or social forestry. So we've seen these different forms and different considerations, but it really depends on what a country needs at which level, to the extent of the level of legislation they need for this. But of course, if you are participating in a voluntary carbon market, these standards would usually require a benefit sharing plan. How are you going to share this with your stakeholders? Who are the communities that are involved? How will they access from it? And then in terms of, and so that's essentially what a country has to consider. So just to add that from the national perspective. Back to you, Mr. Facilitator.
Thank you, Selena. I recognize the distinguished delegate of USA.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the presenters. That really was educational, and we appreciate the excellent information. I wanted to follow up on the suggestion from Peru about thinking about training programs or opportunities to ask whether it might be reasonable for the TSAG or some of the experts participating in this panel to consider with the Secretariat whether there might be a useful item to be developed for the draft BWP that would be presented to the Council for consideration next year. It might be helpful, I think, to have the Secretariat work together with some of these ideas to decide what would be feasible within ITTO's expertise, including cooperation with some other international organizations. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize Germany.
Yes, thank you for giving me the floor, and also from my side, many thanks to all the presenters for the excellent presentations from the broader one with the complicated framework, which we all have to take into account, down to the nitty-gritties of implementation. I have one question in that context to the colleague from New Zealand, and this relates to the decision of the government of New Zealand to develop this system. And the question is, why did the government not decide to take advantage of existing voluntary schemes by just, as another option, offering a framework, guaranteeing that the difficult conditions are met, instead of developing more or less a governmental standard with the very interesting, of course, carbon units? What was the decision-making process behind that? This is maybe interesting also for other countries. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Germany. For that answer, if you allow me, I will ask the distinguished delegate of New Zealand to answer.
Thank you, Germany. As it happened, I did do some policy work on this some years ago. So as Nick noted, we've had a Climate Change Response Act in place since 2008, and our forestry sector was very active in asking for the opportunity to be able to participate in carbon markets, and were strong advocates for their participation. And so we've had the regulated market in place for some time, but essentially it was because they asked. And at the time, the voluntary markets were not well developed, so I guess our regulatory process came first and led the way. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I see no more flags in this room, so I will ask the distinguished delegate of Myanmar to pose your questions.
Hello. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for giving me floor. And also, I'm grateful to all presenters for their very excellent presentations. So I would like to have more information from my colleague from New Zealand, Mr. Nick. In your presentation, I cannot recognize about the beneficiary mechanisms, because you have to manage with different landholders. So how did you negotiate among the different landholders for beneficiaries? Or do you have any specific beneficiary mechanism for landholders? Thank you.
Thank you, Myanmar. I will ask Nicholas for his comments.
If my understanding is correct, you mean how did we ensure that the proceeds from the projects were directed to the appropriate landholders? Every one of the projects is distinct by individual landholder. So the landholder makes, or collective of landholders with the rights to make a decision for an area of a land, choose or not to register their land in the project, and then they collectively receive all of the proceeds from that project and can redistribute those proceeds internally. But all of the proceeds go to each unique holder of the land for their individual block of land based on the carbon sequestration within that land, which means that there's no need to resolve any issues of sort of collective sequestration across a large area and the redistribution to multiple landholders within that area. If I've misunderstood the question, then please correct me.
Myanmar, does it answer your question? If not, you should raise your hand again. It's okay. Do you want Raptor to come on now? We are coming towards the end of the Q&A session, but I'd like to take this opportunity, if I may, to ask a question myself. I find the question from the distinguished delegate of Germany very interesting, and I'm going to pose a follow-up question. I think I will address this question to the distinguished delegates of New Zealand, sitting on my left. Recently, your country has passed some very interesting laws covering the emission of carbon dioxide, methane, and appropriate greenhouse gases on agricultural practices, livestock, and so forth. In the tech group where I come from, we find this rather exciting. This is a world first, and we are wondering what mechanism will be in place for interesting emission of gases from both ends of the animals. So this is an opportunity for us to get clarification of the laws and perhaps the technology involved. Can I ask distinguished delegates of New Zealand to elaborate, please?
Thank you, Barney. Yes, so just less than a month ago, our government announced that they were consulting on proposals for pricing agriculture emissions. This will also come under the same legislation, the Framework Climate Change Response Act legislation. Pricing agricultural emissions is something we have been considering and thinking about for at least 10 to 12 years. And one of the key questions that has been discussed is whether pricing should be at farm level or processor level. At processor level, there's certainly efficiencies, but the incentive is not with the decision makers. So in terms of our process to get here where we are today, we have, in terms of the governance arrangements, we have the government setting the policy, we have an independent body, the Climate Change Commission, which provides independent advice to government, and we have Hei Waka Eka Noa, a collaborative partnership between government and the sector. And that collaborative partnership has been tasked with discussing policies and developing potential solutions. And they were given a deadline, and that was by 2025 they had to come up with a solution. Otherwise, the default would be that they would be brought into the emissions trading scheme. So just to talk about some of the settings that are being proposed and consulted on at the moment. So farmers and growers who are tax registered and meet other livestock and fertiliser use thresholds would be included, and they'd have a responsibility to report and pay emissions. So separate levy prices would be set for long-lived gases, so carbon dioxide versus biogenic methane, to reflect the different climate impact of those gases. The sector collaborative group proposed that they would set the prices, but the government's come back and said no, the government will set the prices. The carbon dioxide price would be set annually and linked to the price, our market price under the regulated emissions trading scheme. But for agriculture, it would be discounted, and that discount would be phased down over time. Biogenic methane would have a unique price, and I'm not across the technical details on how that would be set. But I think that's one of the things they're seeking feedback on. So farmers would have mandatory reporting information. And one of the key things for the sector was that the revenue from the pricing scheme be recycled back into incentives and sequestration payments for the sector. and the remaining will be to fund administration of the pricing scheme. So there'd be a range of incentives for on-farm emissions reduction technologies and practices as they're taken up to help farmers reduce their total emissions bill. Also, there's very substantial support packages wrapped around this, including significant investment in technologies for on-farm practical emissions reduction tools and techniques. There's other things like support with farm advisory services, integrated farm planning to have a framework for consistent and coherent farm plans to help with to help farmers have a plan to reduce their emissions. In terms of recognising sequestration on farm, and that was another key ask of the sector, was that they had the ability to do something within their own land holding and have potential offsets. For our forestry settings, we have quite a high threshold, and this was, quite a technical issue because farmers would like to have riparian strips and small areas of forest recognised, but technically and administratively there's a significant overhead for that for government. So there's still some more details to work through on recognising on-farm sequestration, but at this, in the short term, they've got a simple system for recognising farmers taking action in that respect. But longer term, we'd like to see that linked and consistent with the settings for forestry, the broader forestry sector and the emissions trading scheme. Yes, so I think there's a separate way of addressing emissions from synthetic nitrogen fertiliser use. So, yeah, I think that's in a nutshell. Thank you, Barney. But if anyone's got questions, I can follow up afterwards.
Thank you very much, Anna. We have come to the end of our market discussion this year, and I'll invite all of you to join me to thank the speakers in the usual way. Ladies and gentlemen, the speakers and I will be having coffee outside soon, and you are welcome to come up to us to ask individual questions or discuss anything you like. Before I end this session, we will ask the representative of TAG to read out the trade statement. Mr. Bob Ted from PNG FIA, please. Mr. Z.
How do we get this to work? Hello, it's working. Thank you, Barney. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, and to those attending online. We present our trade statement for this year and note that the US dollar has appreciated almost 13% against the euro and 6% since the start of this year. The Indian rupee has dropped nearly 10% this year against the dollar. The Vietnam currency has gone down 6%, and Indonesian rupiah down 3%. South Korea won and the Thai baht are down more than 10%. China's currency is trading near 14-year lows, and the Malaysian ringgit is at its lowest in 24 years, while the Japanese yen is at its lowest in 32 years. The soaring US dollar in 2022 is especially painful for the forest trade, especially as it comes at a time of global inflationary pressures when prices were already soaring. Disruptions to energy and commodities caused by the Ukraine war, made worse by the COVID-19 recession and recovery. Inflation is at record high in many countries. It is against this dark economic backdrop that the tropical timber trade is bracing for what may lie ahead, an economic recession. If we focus particularly on Europe in the first case, the tropical timber trade has every reason to support the objectives of the so-called EU deforestation regulation, currently being considered by the EC and the EU Parliament. However, we are concerned that in the absence of any meaningful consultation with producer countries or trading partners, including those with which the EU has legally binding partnership agreements, the law as currently drafted risks creating unnecessary technical barriers to trade, particularly for the tropical countries. We note that even European forest and trade associations have raised many questions on how this law can be implemented in practice. Our key concerns for the tropical timber trade and industry include the following. Unlike the EUTR, the proposed deforestation law is not based on a legality standard that respects tropical countries' laws, but prohibits products from legal as well as illegal deforestation. In other words, it is a unilateral approach rather than a cooperative one. As such, it seems contrary to the principles of international law as referenced in our ITTC agreement, that states have the sovereign right to exploit their own resources pursuant to their own environmental policies. The new law would impose binding definitions of terms such as deforestation and forest degradation. These terms are as yet not defined in an acceptable international arena. Depending on the definitions imposed by the EU, the new law could place significant constraints on tropical countries' abilities to develop new forest plantations, even on already degraded forest land. The new law would impose an untested requirement for geolocation to be identified for all consignments of regulated products placed on the EU markets, irrespective of the level of country risk, with significant potential to raise trade barriers, particularly against smallholders and composite products. We believe the EU should avoid using these new regulations to curb free and fair trade and improve on its communications with stakeholders, including those from outside the EU, to assess the challenges faced by business towards meeting compliance. We urge Council to seek clarity. Is the EU walking away from its flag tea by stealth? Producers have already invested heavily into flag tea commitments and are shocked that the EU is now shifting the goalposts. With regard to plantations, industrial tree plantations are needed to augment supply of raw material to the timber industry, as well as planned climate change mitigation efforts by some countries. It is believed that the rate of plantation establishment in the tropics has been hampered by a lack of readily available and reliable information, and it seems in the lack of such information, investors turn to planting agricultural commodities other than trees for a more assured financial return. Tree plantations need investment, training of personnel and establishment of nurseries. ITTO could show leadership to champion tree plantations by taking the following actions. Survey existing tree plantations in member states of the 3 tropical regions, collecting real-time data on species, planting spacing, growth rates, soil specifics, utilisation volumes, cost analysis, and so on. Using the data collected, design a database with appropriate menus for users to access data from actual plantations, whether they be good or bad, so as to make optimal commercial decisions in choice of species, sites, expected returns, etc. We would urge ITTO to publish a plantation handbook containing all relevant technical financial information specifically aimed at potential investors who are going to plant trees. Number 3, carbon trade, which we've just spent many hours discussing. There are various estimates of the global voluntary carbon offsets market ranging from $1 to $2 billion a year. Reportedly, nearly 500 million credits or tonnes of carbon were traded in 2021 at an average price of $4 per tonne. Whatever the actual numbers are, they are indeed huge. The question is, how much of the offsets money is actually going to our member states? As we have just heard from experts in the market discussion, there are relatively few carbon-related projects in ITTO producing countries. The mechanisms in carbon markets are complex and not readily understood. Even the basics of carbon credits and carbon offsets are not understood by many government officials who are not familiar with developments in UNFCCC. Many, if not most, officials in producer member countries do not know how to set up such projects. There is a desperate need to disseminate information and guidance on the opportunities to producing members and at the same time provide strategic advice and technical assistance. A specific challenge is to orient companies towards carbon projects without losing sight of sustainable forest management. National institutions need to be strengthened and different stakeholders engaged in the process. We would urge ITTO to organise technical training workshops to address the weakness and shortcomings of members so they can participate effectively in climate change mitigation while adding to their national revenues. As the likelihood of a global recession looms, there is the risk that financial support for developing projects in member countries will be reduced. This would be unfortunate, as in difficult times, emerging economies need extra help, not less. If a recession comes and is prolonged, resource-rich countries will be tempted to liquidate more of their natural resources to raise money, and this spells potential danger for tropical forests. Not only do we need to tighten our belts, we need to make sure we get the most out of whatever financial resources we have. And this means to invest in ITTO projects wisely for the good of all member states. TAG, as always, stands ready to work with members and the Secretariat to formulate concept notes for our 2 suggested priority projects, which will impact many producer states: a plantation handbook and a technical training workshop for carbon offsets. I would thank delegates for their attention.
Thank you, Bob. And this marks the end of my session. I'll hand it over to our chairperson.
Thank you very much, Barney, and I would just like to say thank you for organising such a wide-ranging and topical session for us here today, and also thank all the speakers for their bringing their obvious expertise here. It's certainly been an honour to have such a deep dive on some of these topics, so thank you very much. And just invite people to give them another round of applause. Thank you. I do just take the opportunity to note that there's a couple of requests from the floor. Also to thank Bob for his trade statement. And I think he's raised a couple of new questions or issues, one being a proposal for information and resources on tree plantations and a technical training workshop. But just given that we are running a bit behind, I think if we could hold further questions until we have just stepped through our 3 remaining agenda items, and then we'll open the floor again for questions and discussions on all the topics that have been raised. So with that, with your permission, Vietnam, we'll just hold your question until a bit later. With that, I invite the Secretariat to report on the market access topic.
So give us a few minutes to clear off.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to share the